Hey, welcome to DynamicsCon. It's great to have you here this morning as we kick off a great couple of days of some just wonderful sessions. The content list is great. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for voting for sessions you were interested in. This is really possible because you participate. So again, thank you so much for that, for everybody in the community. And congratulations to all the other speakers. Again, great couple of sessions ahead of us. I'm Marcus Haug. I'm going to spend a little bit more time introducing myself a little bit later, but want to encourage you to use the chat. Check it out as we go through the session. I love questions. I love interaction. I might not be able to answer your question. Somebody else on the chat may be able to. So again, really hope that you put some questions in the chat, and we will have a great time today. So let's get started. Today we're looking at workflows and job queues and making the system work for you. So that's really the topic of today's presentation. And again, the key here is really about making the system work for you. Two ways to do that are workflows and job queues. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And I've worked with a lot of clients over the years, and one thing I've noticed with pretty typical with clients is these are two things that they just don't use very often. And I think they're two features within Business Central come with the product that are really going to help you and help your organization. All right, a little bit about me. Again, Marcus Haug. I'm currently in a pre-sales role focused really just on the Business Central product, although I do some work with Dynamics GP on occasion as well. I've worked with a variety of partners doing ERP implementations and support work for really 26 years. And I say this because I've worked with Microsoft products and I've worked with non-Microsoft products. And I think it's really key to understand sort of what each product brings to the table. Clearly, there's some consistencies across the products. It's ERP. There's not a tremendous amount of variation there. At the same time, each product does bring some uniqueness to it. So I've worked with Microsoft products, non-Microsoft products. And then in terms of industries, I worked in distribution, manufacturing, financial services, med device, professional services, not-for-profit, food, pharmaceutical, most recently some chemical companies. So again, a lot of variations across these industries. At the same time, there's a lot of consistencies as you look at all of these different industries, you look at the different companies, different organizations that are running the software. So hopefully that is really some experience that I'm bringing to the table today for our discussion. So again, check out the chat as we go through. All right, making your system work for you. As I said, I've done a lot of implementations for all sorts of different companies. And there's been some consistencies in terms of really the outcomes of those projects, and we've had a lot of successful implementations. Again, the list of failed implementations is very, very short, but successful implementations is very long. But a lot of times people actually stop short during the implementation process, and they may replace their system, absolutely replacing functionality, they're operational, but really the question of gaining that efficiency and really making the system work for you. I think there's too many organizations that really stop short of that and really fully realizing the advantages or things that a new system can actually bring to you. And that's really about realizing the gains and in terms of operational efficiency, in terms of eliminating unneeded processes, unnecessary work. So think about streamlining processes, streamlining efficiency, making things as efficient and as effective as possible. That's really what we're after. As I said, it's pretty typical that we would see an organization replaces one system for the other system. And in a sense, they've replicated functionality that served a purpose, maybe served a purpose because of the system, may have served a purpose because of a shortcoming in the system. And oftentimes people stop short of realizing the advantages of what a new system could look like. And really it's about an organization being nimble enough to to really step back and evaluate their processes, evaluate how they do something, and then being flexible enough to make the changes that are necessary to realize those gains of a new system and really fully leverage the new system. Some miss the opportunity to really reap those benefits in changing systems and upgrading systems, and so I want to encourage you to take advantage of that. Some start the process, they start the selection process, they select software, they implement a new system, and there's always this dissatisfaction with a new system, and then you start the selection process over again. I don't want you in that situation. I really think the product we're looking at today is great. If you look across the spectrum of products that are available to us, Business Central is awesome, and we really I want to make sure that you get the most out of your system. So why isn't working again? I think there's some reasons why sometimes systems don't work for people. And the first one I've sort of alluded to, which is really the implementation. This is not finished. And by that, I don't mean that processes that you've set out to create aren't working. So, can you process sales orders and purchase orders and do fulfillment and yeah, you can do all of that. But to me, that isn't the fullness of what an implementation is about. So replicating a process to me is only a component, maybe a very large component, but it's only a component of what a full implementation can be about. And really the full implementation in my mind is about getting the gains and efficiencies, getting the gains and really leveraging the system to its fullest capacity. So I encourage people, don't stop short in your implementation in terms of just replicating processes that you had. Really think about ways to leverage the system. Point number 2, oftentimes I think projects need an additional phase from the go live phase. And I worked with, actually I've got one client in mind, they did a great job of this. And what they did is they established a project team that was really, actually they established an ERP team that was outside of the project team that did the implementation. So this ERP team was really about the longevity of the system, not just about the implementation phase. And they viewed this as a multi-phase project. So there was an implementation team, but that wasn't really the umbrella under which everything was considered. It was this ERP team. And what this ERP team did then was to keep the organization cognizant of the need for really process review, process innovation, really a continual process of improvement and change management within the organization. So not only identifying it, but this team helps adopt those changes within the organization. So that's about people communication, that's about not just the process itself, but what does it mean for people in their everyday jobs? What does it mean for all the other stakeholders that might be involved in a particular process? So again, thinking about additional phases of a project, not just the implementation. The 2 things we're talking about today fit this category for a lot of people. Next one is the implementation was maybe finished, but no additional work has been done on the system. And when you think about Business Central in particular, where we're getting updates twice a year, and these aren't just minor little changes in some cases. These can be some really nice functionality that people can take advantage of. Unfortunately, what I see with some clients is there isn't a process to evaluate those new feature functionalities as they're coming into the environment. What we do is we just sort of have the status quo. Again, we may upgrade our system, we take the upgrade, but it's not a process of reevaluation of those processes at the same time or shortly after the upgrade happens. So again, we're not leveraging new feature functionality that's in the system. 2 things I'm talking about today have actually been around quite a while. So these aren't new features. These are features that are within the application, but the point still stands. Microsoft's adding new feature functionality to Business Central on a very regular cadence. So understanding what those features are and taking advantage of them is really, I think, important. All right, 2 areas in Business Central that we want to look at today that I think could probably help most organizations are job queues and workflows. So those are the 2 pieces that we want to look at today. Job queues. So what is a job queue? The job queue is the ability to automate a process. So that's in essence what it is. These 2 things are similar, but they're a little bit different in terms of workflows and job queues. So job queue is the ability to automate a process. The process is really tied to a report or a code unit. So I'm going to go into the application. We're going to talk about how to set this up, but it is the process of automating the running or the processing of a report or a code unit in Business Central. Interesting component on this, Microsoft actually uses the job queue. So what we're going to see when we get into the application is how Microsoft is actually leveraging the job queue. Now, part of the integration with Dynamics 365 for Sales is actually accomplished using a job queue. It's automating a series of code units that run. There's two components that actually work with the Dynamics 365 for Sales integration. So one of them is the job queue. One of them is virtual entities with the Dataverse. So we're not talking about that component today. All we're talking about as it relates to job queues is just the job queue side of that Dynamics 365 for Sales integrations. So just understand that. Sales forecasting. So if you're using the sales forecast on inventory, for example, the job queue is how Microsoft actually runs that process behind the scenes. Approval delegation, this is where workflows and job queues sort of blend together a little bit. Approval delegation is tied to workflow configuration, but the job queue is actually running in the background so that when a particular approval workflow reaches the point where it needs to be delegated, the job queue is going to do that work for you. And then posting documents. So in purchase and payables setup and in receivables setup, there is some settings in that setup page, on that setup page, that talk about leveraging the job queue for automating processes like posting and sending invoices, that sort of thing. Again, that's the connection, is it's using the same job queue to perform those functions, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, that's Microsoft's leveraging the tool, and we're actually going to go in and look at those job queue entries. We can make changes to them. The end users can also use this. So if you wanted to, just as an end user, again, based on security, you could automate a process like, most typically, I would see a report that wants to run. If you want a age payables report to run on a scheduled basis, you could use the job queue to do that. Actually, if you use the scheduling component on the report itself from the UI of Business Central, it's written to the job queue. The job queue is actually what's used to create that report, even though you're not directly integrating with the job queue. That's the process that's running behind the scenes to do it. And then developers can use this utility. So if you have created custom code that is going to be, or you want to schedule, leveraging the job queue can do that as well. So I'll show you how to actually create those entries if you wanted to as well. Okay, let's look at Business Central here. And I am in Business Central, in the SaaS version of Business Central. So this is in the public cloud version. And if you look up job queues, you're going to get this page, which is going to talk about the job queues that have been created in the system. And let's just talk a little bit about some feature functionality as we look through this. So whole series of job queue entries that have been created in my system. Again, they could be a code unit or a report that runs in the system. I do have a user ID that's identified here, and this is the user that set up the job queue entry to run. So even if you did it from within the UI, let's say deploying the Dynamics 365 sales integration, you don't manually go create these job queue entries. Microsoft, through the back end of enabling that process, will create the job queue entries here, and then whatever user was used to create those, or actually that enabled it, would have their user ID created here, but that's what that user ID does. I'm going to see a caption, description, etc. We'll talk through that a little bit, but let's look at the options up here. I do have the ability to set the status to ready, on hold, or restart. And the key here is that if a process is on hold, it's not going to run. I'd have to put it either to a ready status, or I can do a restart status. And there's some nuanced differences between that. But restart basically is going to start and stop the thing. Set to status to ready is going to be taking it off hold and putting it to a ready status. Whatever case it is, it needs to be in the ready status for it to run. Okay. New feature, relatively new feature here, is the ability to run it once in the foreground. So let's say in the case of the Dynamics 365 for sales integration, during the initial setup phase, you're creating customers, contacts, whatever it might be. I don't want to wait for the scheduled task to run. I just want to fire that that integration component. I can come in here and run it once in the foreground. Basically, you're just forcing a run. Not that big of a deal, but you can do that and then run it on its own. One thing I do want to show you is actually if I go to this one that's in an error status and I go up to the log entries, Microsoft provides a nice, I think a pretty nice log system that's part of the job queue. It'll show you when the process is run, as well as a length of time running, so duration. So if you have a process that maybe runs a rather long time or something like that, or you're not really sure how long a process is running, you can view it. More importantly, it's allowing you to look at an error message here. And I think as error messages go, they do a fairly decent job of it. So in this case, for example, we actually changed some privileges in Dynamics 365 for sales to trigger this error, and you can see that we get a nice clean error here that says it's missing some privileges, and it actually tells me the specific privilege that's missing. In this case, it was some writability error, read-write capability back into an entity over there, a table over there. But aside from that, you're going to get some decent error messages. Let's talk about, well, let's look at some of these. So in here, as I said, sales forecast that Microsoft uses, the O365 integration. You can see the integration job queue here for units of measure currency. You can read what these are. Key difference here is the virtual entity doesn't copy data. So a virtual entity in the Dataverse, looking at Business Central data, you're actually just looking at the Business Central data back in Business Central. The integration components here that are running with these pieces of the Dynamics 365 sales integration, they're actually moving data back and forth. So that's what this code unit is actually taking data from Business Central, moving it into the Dataverse, or from the Dataverse into Business Central. So that's what those code units are doing. Point being, on those specific code units, there's some pretty sophisticated programming that's happening behind the scenes. So these aren't just for basic things that you might want to run. I can do some fairly sophisticated data movements even with the job queue. So thinking about that in terms of the development piece, that was that last point I had. Developers being able to leverage this, it can be pretty powerful. All right, if I'm going to create a new one, I can come in here and open it up. Actually, you know what? Let's not create a new one. Let's look at one of these that's on hold, and we can talk a little bit more about it. So if I set this on hold, basically then that allows me to make changes to it. So this is a job queue entry that Microsoft, that service created on the integration. I can actually make changes to it. So let's talk about some of those. If you've got a parameter that needs to be sent, you can populate that. I can put these into categories. I do have some ability to look at retry events, durations, if there's a timeout. So you can tweak these if needed. Around, again, retry attempts, et cetera, if you want. More commonly, though, would be to tweak the recurrence, and then basically the interval that those the time between the runs is configurable. So if you don't need a particular job to run every day of the week, you can set specific days for it to run, and then you can either set up a next run formula, or you could do minutes between runs, et cetera, to configure how often does this actually, in this case, synchronize units of measure, for example. So really depends on what you're running, how often you want to run it, et cetera. But just know, even with these standard job queue transactions, you have some ability to make some edits, tweak them to be set up more appropriately for what you need. That's in essence the job queue. So again, code unit report, Microsoft uses it, end users can take advantage of it, developers can take advantage of it, automating processes that run. All right, let's look at the next pieces here, and that is workflows. Now, we have two options when it comes to workflow processes. We've got Business Central workflows, and we have Power Automate. And I'm going to talk through both of these. Towards the end, at least offer some suggestions or some thoughts as you consider why would I want to use one of these over the other one. Another great place for comments. If you've had experience with either of these, if you've got questions around why, feel free to put those in the chat. Again, if other people can offer suggestions, thoughts, that we can have some discussion towards the end, which would be great too. But we got two options here. So let's first talk about what is a Business Central workflow. So it's really centered around transaction approvals. Okay, so there's some nuances here in language, but really just centered around transaction approvals. Those transactions could be master records. They could be documents. So master records, I should back up. That's going to be your customer vendor item, typically, where we would do that, but it's the master record. We can do documents, so that would be sales order, purchase order, invoice processing, that sort of thing. Or we could do journals. So a journal could be a general journal, a payment journal, that sort of thing. That's really where the Business Central workflows are centered around. Okay, now there are some different templates around OCR, the incoming documents piece, but by and large, these are the three types of things we're talking about. It's not just the creation. So the Business Central workflow can be triggered based on the creation of a document or even an edit of a document. Basically, it's an assessment of this transaction to determine, does the transaction meet the criteria to be captured by a workflow. That's kind of what it's looking at. So the master record may or may not be globally set. It could be set based on a filter. So for example, it's a new customer. Maybe that's my workflow approval. It could be, let's say, a change of a value. So there's a template in the system that we'll look at that talks about the change of a credit limit. So we say, if the credit limit increases, then I want to go through an approval process. Phone number changes, I don't care. So conditionally setting around those approval transactions. Documents, very similar. I might talk about a department, the dollar amount, something like that. Maybe it's a particular customer vendor, but that's what those could be. And then journals, we're familiar with the general journal. We do have the ability to do either line item or batch approvals with journals. I always caution a little bit on line item approvals, but batch approvals make sense. Because it's a journal, though, if you're familiar with Business Central, all those other journal types are available to us. So that's really the pieces we're talking about. They are template based, and I would encourage people to just use the templates. I'll show you how to create one, but the template is going to give you the building blocks, and they're going to have sort of what happens if it's delegated, what happens if it's rejected. They're going to have all that configured ahead of time, and you're going to use those pieces and tweak them as needed, but there's no reason to create them from scratch. So start with a template. In terms of the structure of the workflow, they really work on these on this premise. So there's an event. There can be a condition on the event, or there would be a condition on the event, and then there's a response to the event. Okay, so that's the general structure of how workflows work. So let's go back into Business Central and let's spend some time actually in the product. We all get sick of PowerPoint. So let's go to workflows. All right, I've got some workflows in my system, some around finance, purchasing, whatever. I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to start from a workflow template. Again, you can create one from scratch. Personally, I think that takes more time than you need. It's faster to start with a template and tweak it. So let's start with a template. In terms of the templates that we have, they're categorized. So we do have, overdue. So that would be your delegated transactions. What do you want to do if they're past due? Around finance, and again, that's the journal batch header. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Incoming documents, so that's the OCR process that is in Business Central. There are specific workflows that center around those processes. Vendor approval, and then the purchase documents, we've got some specific sales and marketing approvals, such as customer credit limit change, item price limit change, that sort of thing. So again, those will give you examples of templates that are really focused around the filtering or the analysis of a particular field value. So not just change, so it's not a Boolean, yes, it changed, no, it didn't. But this could also evaluate the type of change that's happening. Okay, so that's the credit limit one. And then you've got a list of sales documents, which in essence is a mirror of your purchasing documents. So let's just open up one of these that's in the system, and when you create a template or when you use a template, it just populates this at a time. So that's what it is. Let's go across the top a little bit and show you some options here. You do have a nice import-export capability in approvals. I encourage people that are using approvals, if you've already gone live with your system, don't put these in your live environment. Either set up a test company or use your sandbox environment to work with workflows. The worst thing that can happen is you're going to start enabling workflows. You're going to bog up your system because nothing can be processed, and you're going to be troubleshooting it with live documents, right? Don't do that. Use a test environment, set it up, and there is an import-export option here within Business Central to get the workflows move from one environment to the other. Okay, so that's an option. We're gonna have a coded description, a category. This enabled flag, this tells us, or tells the system is this particular workflow enabled or not? Obviously, an enabled workflow is the one that's being used. You cannot make changes to a workflow that's enabled. You have to disable it, and then you can make changes to it. So there is ways to edit this if you need to. All right, key things down here to look at. We have a when event, and then we have the condition, and then we have a response. So like I showed you in the PowerPoint, these are the three building blocks to your workflow process. Although this isn't visual, this is a flow chart. Okay, so once you understand how the different lines relate to one another, there is a process of indenting lines that tells you what stage or where in the workflow process you are, but it is a workflow process, just not, it's not super visual in that sense. So I have an event, and again, you can use the templates to start with, but if you're building from scratch, you can take these events, these workflow events, and actually create your own structure if you want. You can also add to these. So if you've got multiple branches in a workflow approval, you could build the branch inside of one workflow, or you can have multiple workflows. So as long as a particular condition is, a document can only meet one of the workflow conditions if it's the same table. So let's say a sales document. If it's multiple conditions, I may have to build it into one workflow. If it's separate conditions, let's say department, at that case you could do separate ones. So there's some layering that can happen if you wanted to. But point being, we select an event, then we have a condition on it. The conditions are really identical to your list views. They're identical to your report parameter pages. Okay, so you've got the ability to filter, and you can really filter on any of the field values that are in the system, including extended fields if you want. This is where I say, conditionally what applies. Thing to note here, if you're familiar with the architecture of Business Central, this is, although it's called the sales order approval workflow, the only reason it's called that is because the template has redefined or has predefined a document type. So if you want an approval workflow process created on an order, on a return order, sales return order, you actually could use the template from the sales order, and then all you're going to do is you're going to change the condition on the header record to say it's a sales return order versus the order, and you've created another one. But again, you've leveraged the template to do that. Okay, so again, go back to the template and then tweak the field settings that you need. Obviously, you can say, what do I do with this? Statuses, dollar amounts, departments, that sort of thing. I can go down to the filter totals by, just like I would on a report, and I can apply some line item, or I can evaluate based on line item values for the approval as well. Then I'm going to have a response, and this is really where using a template helps, because the individual responses have all been, templates have been set up for you. So set up a record restriction, set the document to pending approval status, send an approval request. In here, I've got approval users, I've got groups, I can do tiered approvals, I can do all sorts of different stuff here in terms of the approver setup and the workflow user group setup. Just back up one step here, you do need to create approval users in the system. So although my user has been set up, I'm not in the approval system until I've been created in the approval system. So there's a little bit of setup there that's required. A little bit on licensing. A team user can be used to process approval transactions. So you do not need to set up a full user or buy a full user license. You can leverage team users. So in terms of an entry point, yeah, there is a cost for people to use the approval system, but it's not a full user. It's really a fraction of that cost. So this is really where that logic then is set up. Add the record restriction, who's going to do it. Then I've got the branches here. So if the request is approved, what am I going to do? If there's another approver on the list, what do I need to do? If it's rejected, what am I going to do? If it's an approved sales document and it's canceled, so the sales order document itself is canceled, what happens now? The point being is, using a template, all those conditions are set up. If you're building one from scratch, you're going to have to remember, how do I catch all those different nuances in the system? If it's approved, what am I going to do? And if it's delegated, what am I going to do? But in essence, that's what I've got in the system. As I said, we can create multiples of these. You can tier them, you can layer them if you need to, that sort of thing. Again, I'd say test these out in your test system. Don't evaluate them in your live system, evaluate them in that test system. Just a note, I'm going to go to the customer record, and if I open up a customer here, This approval, so on your documents that require an approval process, this is the send approval, cancel approval request. If it is a, let's say, a document, so sales order, purchase order, that sort of thing, once I release it, it flows into the approval process. So that's really how that works in the system in terms of Business Central itself. Okay. All right. So we looked at master documents, master records. I'm sorry. We looked at documents. We talked about journals. Use the template, and it's in this condition response setup. All right, let's talk about, and the users need to be in Business Central. That's the other caveat in terms of licensing. Okay, let's talk about Power Automate. So Power Automate is, think in terms of transaction workflows. So this is more than just approvals. So point number one, can we do approvals leveraging Power Automate? Yes, and for some cases, it's actually more robust features than what you have in Business Central. But yes, you can do approvals. So we can do approvals on master records, documents, and journals, replicating the features that we have in Business Central. We also, though, with Power Automate can do data movements. So Power Automate allows us to leverage connectors. So Business Central is one application that we can connect to. So Power Automate, part of the Power Platform sitting outside of Business Central, we provide Business Central has a connector to Power Automate. So we can then monitor for things inside of Business Central that could have been picked up by the Business Central workflow process, like a record is created or a transaction approval has been requested, that sort of thing. So we've got those triggers that we can link to. We also, though, can do other things. So not just inside of Business Central, we can connect then, because of those events, to other systems like Outlook. So instead of using the approval system built inside of Business Central, we can actually use the Power Automate workflow system connected into Outlook, and somebody now could approve or reject a transaction inside of Outlook. They don't actually need to navigate back to Business Central to do that. Now, do they need a license? Yes. But the key here is I don't have to send them to Business Central to do it. They could do it right with an email. They actually can do it in Teams. So if you're an organization that's starting to leverage Microsoft Teams, you can send workflow approvals to a user's activity feed. You could send it to a particular channel, that sort of thing. They also don't need to be approvals. So you could send an alert to a Teams channel or sending in a message, for example, to somebody. Then we also have the ability to interact with other applications. So this allows us to connect to over 250 other applications besides just Business Central, Outlook, and Teams. You could connect to SharePoint or Dropbox or Evernote, or there's a whole host of other applications, even outside the Microsoft stack of applications that you now can interact with. So instead of having an approval process happen because a job was created, you could create a Dropbox folder for that job because the job was created. Okay, so it's not just saying, is the job approved? I actually want to do something because the job is approved. Okay, so that's application interaction. Triggers for Power Automate can be manual, so I can say execute this Power Automate flow. They can be event-based, so that would be like the trigger that was inside of Business Central. An item is created, so therefore something is going to happen. They also could be scheduled, so a schedule could be every hour or something like that. I want something to happen. Events could also be, well, actually events and manual also sort of breaks the paradigm that we have, in the sense that we can trigger a Power Automate workflow from within a Power BI report, for example. So if we want to not only present data in Power BI, but we want to allow some sort of interaction to happen because of that, I could trigger something based on a Power BI report. I'm viewing it now, I want to do something. Power Apps can also trigger a Power Automate workflow. So things like that can happen. The other thing in terms of data interaction, before I get too far, is we have the ability to actually write back to Business Central. So this isn't about a triggered event that's sort of off in a never land. We can actually create transactions based on other events happening. So I worked with one client, they used a SharePoint for billing transactions. And when an engineer uploaded a document into a SharePoint file list, a document list, that created a billing transaction using Power Automate back into the job journal. So we can write back and forth between them. In terms of events, we do have the APIs that is available to us. We have OData, that sort of thing, through the HTTP connection as well. So pretty robust options that we have connecting Power Automate back into Business Central. So let's look at Power Automate. So I'm in Power Automate now, and I want to just look at a couple of things. So one thing is this new, actually, let's look at this one. So request approved for a document inside of Business Central. So what I did with this one is I actually was inside of Business Central and I said create Power Automate workflow. Takes me to Power Automate. I used a template that says when a customer approval is requested, do this. And I get this predefined workflow structure that's set up. So I still don't have to create all the building blocks or put them together if I don't want to, still template based. So when a customer approval is requested, I have the ability then to designate my company, my environment. I can set conditions, very similar to the conditional statements that we had inside of Business Central. So at this point, pretty similar. I'm going to get the record from a database perspective, from a data elements perspective, and then I'm going to start the workflow approval. At this point, I can now make use of, for example, the records that I captured in this get record setup. So if I want to pass the name, if I want to, in this case, the customer, I want to pass the customer name, address, salesperson, whatever information I want to pass on, I can pass that on as part of the email. I could use it in a different application. I could post it in a Teams channel, whatever I want to do. But I have access then to other data elements inside of Business Central for informational purposes. I do have the ability to create a link over here. So if you know how to construct a Business Central URL, in the approver link, you can actually structure the URL to direct the user not only to Business Central, not only to the page that they are looking for, but to the specific record. So as easy as possible to give users access or visibility to the information they need, we can do that in the link as well. Then what I have is this powerful conditional flow chart that I can set up. So, based on the condition, is it approved, yes or no? Do I want it to go branch someplace else? Do I want it to branch and then send an email? Do I want it to branch and then update a record? Whatever I'd want to do, this pretty robust conditional statements then can be set up. I could connect to other applications based on conditions. You get the point. This is far beyond just I've submitted a purchase order for approval, a particular departmental head reviewed it and then approved the transaction or rejected it, right? If you need to do that, Business Central workflows work great for that. If you're thinking really outside the box in terms of workflow processes and something that is much more than that, Power Automate can allow you to do that. So again, taking the template and then building upon it is really how I would do this if you're learning to create these things. All right, next one I want to show you is something that's pretty common. I've got a sales order process. I shipped the thing. I want to send information to my customer that tells them it's shipped. Well, I can leverage Power Automate to do something like that. And all I'm doing is I'm looking at when a record is created. And in this case, I'm looking at sales shipments. So when a sales shipment is created, what do I want to do? I want to initiate a Power Automate workflow. I'm going to get the record, which is going to get the information from the sales shipment that's just processed. And in this case, I wanted to post to a Teams channel. It just as easy could be an email, which is that second step here, but it says an order for a particular customer has been shipped. It's been shipped this way. I don't know, here's the tracking number, whatever else I'd want to send to the customer or to the channel, for example, and I'm posting that into whatever channel. So maybe you have a channel for the customer or something like that. You could set up this. You could set up alerts around new items being created, or the sky's the limit really in terms of what you want to do or could do with this. There is a connector in Power Automate to a service that does texting. So common request, I'm doing sales order shipments and I want to be able to text my customer. Okay, Power Automate can do that. And it's this exact same workflow approval. The difference here is instead of going to a Teams channel or to Outlook, I'm going to use the texting service and send it that way. There's a fee to use the texting service. It's to the texting service fee, but point being, it is something I absolutely can do today inside of Power Automate. You want to post to Facebook or Twitter or whatever. There's social media connectors. So a lot of different things that you could potentially do leveraging Power Automate in the system. All right, one more flow I wanted to show you, which was, request from approval. Yeah, so the new item, I just did it based on a create trigger that's in the system, but request is the one I created based on a template. So in terms of connectors, I just want to open this up so that you get an idea of connectors that are available. Microsoft adds connectors all the time, but clearly the Microsoft stack of applications connectors available for all of those. These premium ones are ones you'd have to purchase, so it just depends on what type of connector you'd want to go to, but we can go directly to, let's see, SQL Server. GitHub is another common one. OneDrive, Todoist is things I've done. Salesforce actually is a connector I know we've used. Dropbox, I've had clients that have connected to that. We do have the HTTP services that we can connect to. Adobe, I mean, there's hundreds of them that are available. We're just in the B's here. Basecamp is another one I know people have connected to. But thinking about making the system work for you, are there other applications that you connect Business Central to, either to send data or get data from? Because it could be a get data from scenario as well. Potentially leveraging Power Automate could help you do that. So this is the C's, the D's. You get the point. A lot of different elements that are available to us. Some things to consider. So as you're thinking about Business Central workflows, one key difference here is that the user who is processing the workflow is going to be reviewing and approving the transaction inside of Business Central. Now, can we send alerts via email to the user? Yes, that tells them that they have something to approve, but ultimately they're going to have to go back into Business Central to process that approval. Okay, so yes, there's alerts, but they can't actually transact with the approval in the email. They're going to have to go back to Business Central. Some places it's not a big deal, but that's just something to consider. The next thing is that the triggers for Business Central approvals are limited to Business Central, right? So the event has to be related to one of those components that we can flag inside of Business Central. So again, master records, journals, documents, great. If that's the extent of what you want to look at, Business Central can work fine. Have implemented a lot of times because that's all they need. But if you need to go beyond that, then you need to start thinking about something else. Line item approvals. Now, a couple caveats here. Out of the box templates with Business Central, you can put approvals onto documents based on line item values. So we can look at the line item in terms of that filter request, but the approval itself is sitting at the header level. Okay, so if I have a purchase document that goes to 15 different departments, that's not going to work so well in Business Central out of the box. You can customize Business Central via an extension to manage this a little bit different, but that's going to be some development involved in that. So you could do it that way. In terms of out of the box, I can't really deal with line items very well. Okay, so just know that that's the case in the Business Central ones. Let's talk some Power Automate things that I know we've run into. Limited workflow stage tracking. So this is an issue Microsoft acknowledges. They're aware of it. They're working on it. But inside of Business Central, when I create a workflow, I have the ability then to see where is it in the stage, who's it waiting for, has it been delegated, all that sort of stuff about it. Power Automate's more of a black box. So the transaction is going to go into the approval workflow. I don't have a tremendous amount of visibility in terms of knowing, who is it waiting for, that sort of thing. Again, Microsoft is aware of it. They acknowledge that, and it's coming, but it's not there right now. So just know that you're going to have to live with that. Some people, again, it doesn't matter, that they can live with it, not a problem. Some other people, that's more of an issue. So it's just, again, something to consider as you're thinking about, how am I going to implement this? All right, connections to other applications. So as I pointed out, Power Automate has the ability to connect to hundreds of other data sources or other applications. So if you want to do something other than a traditional submit the document, review the document, approve the document, if I want to submit an item, again, creating a Dropbox folder, a SharePoint folder, if I want to monitor a SharePoint document list and then do something back into Business Central workflows aren't going to do that. Power Automate can. And again, it could be just, I want to leverage Teams and Outlook to help facilitate an approval process. I've had some people that go this route just because of that. Again, the ability to approve or reject the transaction without having to go into Business Central. Maybe I've got people that are traveling all the time. They want to be able to do it on their phone. There's some implications to that as you think about it. All right. Some final thoughts here as we wrap up. Hopefully you're putting questions into the chat here. really encourage you, leverage the system that you have to your advantage. So this goes beyond just workflow approvals and Power Automate. Thinking about ways to leverage the system and have your system work for you. Too often people replicate processes for valid reasons that are no longer valid, right? We did it this way because there was a limitation to our old system. It was the way the process had to work. There was a valid reason at the time to doing something the way you did it. That's no longer valid. So think through those things and think of ways that you could leverage the system to really help you again gain those efficiencies, the effectiveness, leverage the dollars you're spending. Point number two, automation does not equal time or cost savings. You need to evaluate automation. So as much as I say leverage the job queue and leverage the workflow system, there are scenarios where that doesn't make any sense, right? Automation for the sake of automation, I'm not a fan of that at all. I sometimes see that too often as well. You really need to do an evaluation on ROI. That could involve the development cost. It could involve licensing costs. So if we need to get licenses for Business Central, for example, you need to take that into consideration. You need to take into consideration maintenance of a system. So if you're thinking about a workflow approval system that's really complex, are you getting the value out of that? And what sort of maintenance may you have in there? All right, next point, change is always necessary. I really encourage clients to establish a process to review and improve internal processes as they relate to your ERP system. Not only looking at feature functionality that was delivered with your application when you initially implemented it, but looking at and evaluating the potential use of new feature functionality as releases happen, particularly when we think about a Business Central SaaS option where you're getting feature functionality released on almost a monthly basis, but certainly on that 6-month cycle. So take a look at that stuff, and I really encourage you to keep a process of continual change within your organization. So really appreciate you joining us today. Again, thank you for those who voted for our session. Good morning. Lots of good questions in the chat. I pulled some out as we were going through. So let me just, in this live session, let me just hit a couple of those. There was a question about, is it possible to implement a workflow or to approve or reject the request directly from the email interface without having to go into Business Central? So that really is the difference. One of the big differences between the Business Central workflow engine and using Power Automate. So when you use Power Automate, you actually do have the ability to approve or reject right within the email. Personally, I love that option because I'm not requiring the users to navigate someplace else. So as we looked a little bit at Power Automate, you can send additional information about the transaction that the user needs to maybe see to approve or reject the transaction. And you can do that right, again, with an email. I put a plug-in for Teams too. You actually can do that via the activity channel, or you can do it via a team, right? So you can put it in there and you can do that as well. Let's see. There was another question about, does an existing trigger of a BC, trigger in BC with Power Automate work with custom objects when working with a workflow to approve or reject the transaction directly from an email? Okay, so yes, you can leverage custom objects with the workflow engine. Personally, if you're going to do that, I like the Power Automate option. There's some API options, there's OData options, et cetera, to track those changes within Business Central. And I think you're going to have more flexibility. Certainly as an end user, you're going to have more flexibility leveraging the Power Automate engine to do that. That said, using the extension model inside of Business Central, you actually can add or enhance or create new templates actually in the workflow system. So you've got that option if you want to. That's going to be more of a development effort than I think leveraging Power Automate. So totally up to you, but that's an option for you. Is it possible to execute execute a post transaction after a check print? That's an awesome enhancement. I don't think there is. There is an option for posting documents. So I don't know if that could be leveraged into the check printing process. I mean, in theory, you've got a flag there that you could monitor for a check print. I haven't tried that, but I mean, that's an awesome example of leveraging workflows if you could get it to work. Approver on vacation, out for a week, and then getting delegation done. This is just so common in terms of a scenario. First thing I would say is I'd back up a little bit is to say, if you're going to do workflow processes, I think it's really important that you document those workflow processes. So under what conditions is an approval process needed? Delegation needs to be part of that workflow process, right? What are you going to do if a person is on vacation? How is that going to work? In terms of delegation within Business Central, you do have the ability as the workflow admin to monitor those essentially the documents that are awaiting approval, and you can force a delegation. So based on the user setup, you can determine who's going to get those. It is an issue if someone's out and they forget to flip over delegation or something like that. You're going to have to clean those up. Personally, I think the Business Central workflows manage that process a little bit better. They're going to give you within the user interface a view of the documents. You can just quickly delegate them. It's a little more complex in the Power Automate world. So just know that that's going to be, it's just not as tidy of a process to do that. Here's a common question. We require a sales order approval on the initial entry, but only want an approval to reoccur if the sales order amount has changed. Great question. So within Business Central, the workflows really leverage the open released process on a document. So you go open, pending approval, and then they're in a release state. Once you have an approval on a document, you really lock up some changes that can happen to the document. Amount happens to be one of them. So if you need to change the sales order amount, you need to take it essentially out of the workflow process, change the amount, and then put it back through the workflow process. So there really isn't a way to not require an approval to happen again, because that's just the way that the approval engine works. Is you're not going to be able to bypass the approval. So that's what it's built in to do. So we're actually out of time. So I want to thank DynamicsCon for sponsoring this event. I want to thank our sponsors. Thank you for participating. There were just a tremendous amount of great questions in this session. Check out the next day and a half, the sessions that are there. Awesome content, and I hope you enjoy your time. So thanks for being with us this morning.